Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to turn our attention to public order crimes, and we're going to try to figure out what happens when simple, often non-violent crimes occur. With public order crimes, these are the types of things that are illegal because cities and municipalities do not want to be able to see issues like vagrancy happening on their streets. But we have to ask ourselves whether or not some of these crimes are worth our time and effort, or if we can put these resources to better use rather than criminalizing the homeless. So let's begin making our way through this lecture. First, we have the issue of disorderly conduct. Disorderly conduct can happen in a variety of ways in a variety of settings, but the base definition states that this is any behavior which constitutes a break of the peace that is disturbing to others. Well, that's a very subjective term, isn't it? Sometimes we can see it outright. If someone is standing around yelling and screaming in a public place and won't be settled down, then that could probably be considered disorderly conduct, no questions asked. But sometimes the police can use this as a way to break up or to disperse a crowd that's gathering, like a house party or a block party that's just simply getting too rambunctious. In these instances, there is a lot of interpretation to be had here. Remember that disruptive can be subjective in nature. Does that mean that the action is disruptive to the other people around me, or disruptive to the police because they're over here dealing with me? Really, it can be applied to anything that is disruptive. If the person does not settle, then they can be arrested for disorderly conduct charges. One of the best and most well-documented examples of disorderly conduct is the Don't Tase Me Bro incident that took place in 2007 on the University of Florida campus. Senator John Kerry was invited to speak on the campus, and during the end of the speech, he invited the audience up to ask questions. A senior mass communication student, Andrew Meyer, took the microphone and asked Senator Kerry about whether or not he was a member of a secret fraternity organization. Meyer had been previously disruptive during the speech, and the university police felt as though he was being too disruptive during the Q&A. They then asked him to leave and forcibly began to remove him when he resisted. When Meyer continued to struggle and resist, the police threatened to tase him, and they finally did. Before the tasing occurred, Meyer can be heard shouting, "Don't tase me, bro." The entire incident was caught on camera and posted to YouTube. We're actually now going to watch that clip so you can see what I'm referring to. As you can see, when individuals cause a scene like this one in a public forum, police often feel as though they must take care of the situation. There were some allegations of excessive force on the part of the officers, but ultimately no charges were filed against them. Meyer received 18 months of voluntary probation in exchange for a deferred prosecution of the disorderly conduct charges. Sometimes voices cannot be silenced, and if too many people continue to stir the pot, larger issues like riots can occur. We've seen a lot of rioting take place in the last year, but this is not anything that's really new. Our country has been rioting before it was even officially formed. We've been rioting for a while now. We've had riots over unions who wouldn't cooperate with business owners, riots over alcohol, riots over immigration post-Civil War, riots about food shortages during the Civil War and during the Great Depression, and then of course the race riots that we've had in the 1960s. But in discussing riots, I always like to use the example of the 1992 Watts Riots. For those of you who may not remember the Watts Riots, which were these riots were sparked after the police beating of Rodney King. The riots didn't actually take place right after the beating, but instead they began once the police were acquitted in criminal court for the beatings. Protesters took to the streets, they set things on fire, they looted, and things really turned violent quite quickly after that. 53 people actually died in these riots, and more than 2,000 were injured during the 6 days that the city was rioting. More than 3,700 buildings were burned, and there was about $1 billion worth of property damage that took place during the riots. This is a picture that was taken on the very first day of the Watts Riots. The picture is of truck driver Reginald Denny, who happened to be stopped at a red light in his truck in the worst location in the whole city. He was dragged from the truck, and he was beaten by Black and Hispanic rioters. The whole attack was actually caught on camera from above using a news helicopter. The reporter was covering the beating, and the people who were watching it on the news actually came out of their houses to Mr. Denny's rescue. The news coverage of the riots was one of the first instances in which aerial news coverage had occurred. Mr. Denny was actually trying to get back in his truck and drive away, but he was unable to. So the bystanders that came to help him drove him to the hospital in his semi-truck. He survived that, but was permanently disabled as a result of the beating. In these photos, you can actually see the Rodney King beating happening in the upper left-hand corner. In the other photos, you can see some of the property damage that occurred during the riots and pictures of the police who were trying to reassert control during this 6-day campaign. Criminological theorists James Wilson and George Kelling have actually published broken windows theory in the late 1980s, stating that members of a community have the duty and responsibility to take care of their surroundings rather than to let them fall into decay and disrepair. It all starts with one broken window, they say. If that window is not repaired, then a second window is going to be broken, and then a third. Next might come graffiti, larger scale destruction, and eventually issues like gang activity and drug sale and drug use will become a pressing issue within that community. In other words, the theory suggests that if you can stop urban decay when it was still in its beginning stages, then you have a better shot of maintaining the integrity of the community and to eliminate the causes of criminal behavior. I actually have a series of photos that best exemplify the idea of broken windows theory. Here in this picture, you see a man who's walking in front of what used to maybe be an apartment building. There's a lot of trash around, the landscaping is basically non-existent, and everything in this photo is pretty much in disrepair. Here you see the suburbs for which most part don't exist anymore. Things have been demolished, buildings are left in disrepair, and what little is left doesn't look like a whole lot. There's a lot of land available, but no one is around to really build or take care of the surrounding environment. Here is actually a gorgeous building that was probably really something when it was in use. Now you can see that the grass is overgrown in front of it, the windows are busted out, it's dirty, and it's just not fit for people anymore. This actually used to be a train station. This was one of the biggest train stations in the United States, and the interior was simply astonishing. Now it's just a vacant building taking up space. This is a house which is pretty much destroyed. It actually looks like it was probably a very nice house at one time, but the owners probably lost it, maybe in the recession, perhaps even sooner than that. But there's no one around to take care of it, so probably some kids got to it, broke out the windows, they graffitied the walls, and they probably have destroyed the inside too. Look around the rest of the neighborhood. There isn't much left. It's winter, which would probably account for the absence of some of the landscaping, but there just isn't anything to this neighborhood, which was probably booming at some point. And for those of you who haven't figured out the city in question yet, we're really talking about Detroit here. This is a city that used to be so big and prosperous due to the amount of industry that was located there. But then industry dies down and a lot of our manufacturing moves overseas, which means fewer jobs here. No jobs, no money, and very quickly these major cities start to decline. This house is probably about, let's say, 2 to 3 miles from the GM building that you see in the center of downtown. Can you imagine how much that you would pay for a house like this in Manhattan or Boston that gives you the same proximity to downtown? Here is Detroit. You can buy houses there for about $100 a piece. The taxes are going to kill you, but the structures and the property are so cheap right now that you can buy a house with the cash in your pocket. This is broken windows theory in action. When people leave the city and there's no one left to take care of things, the entire community starts to feel the effects. Vagrancy and loitering those laws are mainly in effect to combat homelessness, but not combat in a positive way that is helpful for the homeless, but rather as a way for cities to not have to deal with the issue properly. So vagrancy laws basically mean that you cannot sleep outside in public areas, you cannot panhandle for money, and you really can't disrupt the daily activities in the cities and the streets. Loitering, on the other hand, focuses on location. You cannot stay in one place for too long without an apparent purpose. All right, well, what if I'm panhandling? That's probably a pretty good purpose, right? I'm trying to make some money. Not according to the law. Some cities have actually adapted panhandling zones that allow for individuals to ask for money at certain times and only within certain spaces. Cities are really cracking down hard on this issue. The book gave you the list of the 10 meanest cities in the United States, and this map, you will see that some cities are actually banning individuals from feeding the homeless. This means that churches, shelters, and other organizations will be limited in how many homeless they can actually feed a day, the locations in which they can feed them, and times in which they can feed them. And sometimes the laws completely ban the action altogether. On this map, you'll see that both Florida and California have the most laws in place banning food sharing with the homeless. In November 2014, Fort Lauderdale, Florida actually instituted a law that placed very strict limits on food sharing and required that the action take place inside of a shelter or a church facility. So now let me introduce you to Mr. Arnold Abbott. He's a 90-year-old man and a war veteran who was one of the first to be arrested under this new law in Fort Lauderdale. Mr. Abbott had been helping to feed the homeless for more than 20 years. He had been doing it since his wife died in a car accident, and he created the organization called Love Thy Neighbor Incorporated in her honor. She worked with the homeless before she died, and now he's continuing her work for her. There are large homeless populations in Florida because the weather is so much nicer there. If you have to be homeless, you don't want to be homeless up north, so they come to sunny and warm climates. Florida, in turn, has tightened the ropes substantially and has severely limited what can and cannot be done. The new law actually states that the new regulations enacted in Fort Lauderdale mean that no two indoor feeding sites can be within 500 feet of one another or even on the same block. Outdoor feeding programs require a permit or permission of the property owner, and you also have to provide portable toilets. And outdoor stations cannot be within 500 feet of residential properties. Mr. Abbott was unable to provide the porta potty even though he did have proper permitting to feed the homeless outdoors. Of course, the police felt forced and they had to arrest Mr. Abbott on the first day the new law was enacted. Mr. Abbott faced 60 days in jail and a $500 fine. After he bonded out, he was back out on the streets feeding the homeless the very next day and stated that he was fine with being arrested again. The arrest created such an uproar in the city that it actually sparked protests outside of City Hall. The city actually backed down and the prosecutor dropped all charges against Mr. Abbott. The voices were so strong in opposition to the new law, and the anger was so strong about Mr. Abbott's arrest that the city had to reverse their decision, and they lifted the ban against feeding the homeless. Finally, we're going to switch gears rather drastically in comparison to our discussion of Mr. Abbott and his work in feeding the homeless. To end our lecture today, we're going to focus on prostitution. Let's begin with saying that prostitution is not a paraphilia, and it is not a sexual expression of the prostitute's sexual interests. It is, however, an action that holds some sort of sexual significance for the customer. This might be the customer's only sexual outlet, or it might be a way for the customer to engage in specific sexual behaviors that he cannot have with a significant other. There might be things that his wife doesn't want to do or he doesn't want to do with her because she's his wife, but he does feel that he's comfortable enough doing it with a prostitute. At the root of it all, prostitution is all about that economic transaction. Prostitution is work, and the women treat it as such. Prostitution is an exchange of sexual favors for money, drugs, or for some other item. It's an economic exchange. But because it is just business, there's no romantic relationship or emotional tie in place. Women do sometimes run into regular clients, especially when you have call girls and high-end escorts. The Johns rely on discretion, and he might want to go to the same girl every time. Or he might favor specific girls, but there is not necessarily an emotional relationship present, especially on her end. It's not very difficult to find a prostitute at all. We don't know how many prostitutes there actually are, especially in the United States, because it's an illegal action almost everywhere. So we have to rely on arrest records to at least get some basis of frequency, but we don't know for sure. Those numbers often include multiple arrests for the same girls, so it's not a reliable set of numbers. Prostitutes can keep themselves very well hidden, especially if they work indoors. But we have to answer the question of why prostitution is a crime here in the United States when it's legal in so many other countries. Prostitution laws in our country were built around the premise that if the actions were to be outlawed, it would then cut down on diseases that have notoriously followed prostitutes around. Ironically, illegal prostitutes actually test positive for STDs and HIV/AIDS at a much higher rate than those prostitutes who work in regulated and legal establishments. So that argument doesn't work out too well. The other arguments center on family issues, exploitation of the women who work in the profession, and the immorality that some believe are tied to the work. We actually have very different views regarding prostitution comparative to other countries, particularly those found in Europe. We often have very different views on sexuality, too. But in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, prostitution is treated as a career with regulations surrounding the profession. The Netherlands is an interesting place because in Amsterdam, prostitution is really a tourist destination. The red light districts, like the one found in this picture, are famous and the girls willingly choose to work there. They apply for the job and they're not hired if there's any concern that they have been trafficked. But the women actually receive full benefits for their work. They get to choose what clients they want. They have security and panic buttons to alert the bouncers. There is mandatory condom use, mandatory STD screenings, and no negotiation on prices. The women get health care, retirement, and they pay taxes on all of their income. When the red light is on, that means that the girl is available. When the red light is out, then she is with a client. You can pick the girl from the window, but she is the ultimate decision maker whether or not she will have you as a client. Sex trafficking rates actually tend to be lower in places where prostitution is both legal and regulated. If it is just legal, then there's a lot more trafficking that can occur. But sex trafficking rates are the highest in areas where prostitution is illegal or where governments often turn their heads to the problem because the money from trafficking is so good. This picture also shows a view of the red light district in Amsterdam, but you'll notice that there are both red and blue lights present in the windows. Any ideas as to why the lights might be blue? Amsterdam is a city that caters to all types of clientele. Blue lights signify transgender prostitutes who are still biologically male. For a while, there were no distinction in terms of the lights, and some clients were getting surprised when they hired a woman for the night and did not get what they were expecting. After several instances in which the Johns actually tried to attack the prostitutes, these new measures were put in place in order to maintain the safety of those who work there. This lecture focused on a variety of different crimes ranging from disorderly conduct to rioting, all the way through prostitution and feeding the homeless. These might sound like odd things to be talking about together, but they all fit within the arena of public welfare and public order types of crimes. Next time, we're going to continue to explore things that fall into the welfare area. In the next lecture, we're actually going to look at more widespread types of crimes, such as drug use and gambling. Join me in the final lecture of the semester when we explore Chapter 12 of the textbook, Social Order and Morality Crimes. I'll see you then.